What happens when the world's biggest star, a man crowned the king of rock and roll, suddenly seems vulnerable before his own audience? In February 1970, Elvis Presley walked into the Houston Astrodome to perform before one of the largest indoor crowds ever assembled. Over 40,000 people packed the stadium for each of his 6 shows during the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. The press called it history in the making, the return of a legend to the kind of massive arena that had defined his early career. But for Elvis, it wasn't just another performance. The Astrodome was unlike any venue he had ever played. Its cavernous size and strange acoustics turned the roar of the crowd into something overwhelming. Instead of one wave of sound, Elvis could hear individual voices echoing through the space, each one sharp and piercing, as if thousands of people were calling to him personally. For a man who had always balanced his public image with private insecurities, that sound was unsettling. Some who were there remember Elvis appearing unusually tense. That night, he seemed quieter backstage, more withdrawn than usual. Friends recalled him muttering that it was a lot of people out there. For someone who had already conquered Las Vegas, already reminded the world of his power in the 1968 comeback special, the idea that he could still feel rattled seemed almost unthinkable. And yet, that is exactly why the Houston shows have become so legendary. Fans who were there tell stories of a moment when Elvis hesitated, when the sheer scale of expectation pressed down on him. Whether it lasted for seconds or minutes, what they remember is how the audience responded, not with impatience, but with compassion. For many, it was the first time they saw not just Elvis Presley the superstar, but Elvis Presley the man. That night at the Astrodome wasn't only about breaking attendance records. It became, in the memory of those who were there, a story about vulnerability, connection, and the power of music to turn fear into healing. By early 1970, Elvis Presley stood on top of the music world once again. Just 2 years earlier, his 1968 television special had reignited his career, proving to the world that the king still had his crown. His Las Vegas residency in 1969 was a sensation night after night. He filled showrooms with energy and charisma, blending rock and roll with gospel, rhythm and blues, and ballads that left audiences breathless. Critics who had doubted his relevance were forced to admit that Elvis was not just back, he was bigger than ever. And yet, even in triumph, there was tension beneath the surface. The weight of constant expectation was never far from him. For every standing ovation, there was the pressure to deliver it again the next night. For every headline praising him as untouchable, there was the quiet fear that one stumble would expose him as ordinary. Fame had given Elvis everything: money, recognition, adoration, but it had also taken something away: the freedom to be uncertain, to be human. The Houston Astrodome represented a new challenge. Nicknamed the eighth wonder of the world, it was unlike any space Elvis had ever performed in, bigger than the Las Vegas stages, bigger than most arenas. It was designed for rodeos and baseball games, not music. When Colonel Tom Parker booked the shows as part of the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, he promoted it as the biggest indoor concert ever held. Tickets sold out quickly, and the promise was spectacle on a scale no one had attempted before. But size can be a double-edged sword. The Astrodome's acoustics made it difficult for musicians to hear clearly on stage. The crowd's roar didn't blend into one rolling wave. It broke apart into echoes, bouncing back in fragments. Elvis, who had always drawn strength from the unified energy of an audience, suddenly felt bombarded by scattered voices. Each scream sounded isolated, personal, like 1,000 different demands all at once. Backstage, friends noticed a shift in his demeanor. Joe Esposito, his road manager, asked if he was all right. Elvis gave a half smile but admitted quietly, "That's a lot of people out there." His longtime friend Charlie Hodge recalled that Elvis seemed unusually reflective, less playful than normal before a show. To them, it was just nerves, but to Elvis, it was something heavier. Because the truth was, Elvis wasn't afraid of singing. He wasn't afraid of the music. What unsettled him was the feeling that this crowd didn't just want a show, they wanted him, the man behind the legend. And deep down, Elvis worried about what they would see if the mask slipped. Would they still love him if he faltered? Would they still call him the king if he looked uncertain, vulnerable, human? This was the question quietly pressing on him as the minutes ticked down to his entrance. The world was about to watch him stand under lights brighter than ever, in front of more people than most could imagine. And in the quiet of that backstage moment, Elvis Presley, the idol of millions, felt the very thing no one expected: doubt. The moment Elvis walked out into the Astrodome, the crowd erupted. More than 40,000 people stood and cheered, their voices colliding in a deafening wall of sound. To most performers it would have been intoxicating. For Elvis it was overwhelming. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, his white jumpsuit glowing under the stage lights, and for a brief instant everything looked exactly as it should. The king had returned to a stadium-sized audience, and the audience gave him their roar. But then came the pause. Some who were there recall that Elvis seemed to hesitate, as though the sheer immensity of the moment pressed against him. He stood at center stage, not moving toward the microphone. The band, waiting for his cue, held back. The cheers rolled on, but Elvis remained still, caught in the blinding glow of the lights and the unrelenting sea of faces staring back at him. Whether it lasted seconds or longer, the impression left on the audience was unmistakable. It looked like he froze, one fan later recalled, like he was trying to find his breath. Another remembered thinking that Elvis didn't look like the untouchable star from television specials. He looked like a man overwhelmed. The Astrodome itself magnified the tension. The acoustics fractured the noise, so that instead of one united wave of applause, Elvis could hear individual shouts. Each name, each scream, each demand. It felt less like adoration and more like 40,000 separate voices pulling at him. For someone who thrived on connection, it created the opposite: isolation in the middle of a crowd. At first, many in the audience assumed it was intentional, a dramatic pause, a new way to build suspense. Elvis was famous for his unpredictability, for catching crowds off guard, but as the moment stretched on, murmurs began to ripple through the dome. Some whispered that something was wrong. Others exchanged worried glances. And then, according to one oft-repeated fan story, something unexpected happened. A woman seated near the front rows, later identified in retellings as Betty Martinez, stood up. Instead of screaming louder, she began to clap slowly, rhythmically. "It's okay, Elvis," she shouted. "We love you." At first she was alone, but gradually others joined in. What began as scattered clapping spread through the dome, transforming into a gentle wave of encouragement. The restless energy of the crowd softened. The screams faded into supportive applause, words of reassurance echoing from every corner of the stadium. "Take your time. We're here for you. We love you, Elvis." Whether every detail of this story unfolded exactly as remembered, or whether it grew in retelling, the spirit of that moment has endured. Fans chose compassion over impatience. Instead of demanding a flawless show, they offered understanding. On stage, Elvis felt the shift. The suffocating pressure began to ease, replaced by a rhythm he could breathe with. His friend Charlie Hodge stepped close, laid a hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "You hear that, boss? They said not here to judge you. They said here to love you." For the first time that night, Elvis truly looked into the crowd, not as an idol staring down at his subjects, but as a man meeting the eyes of 40,000 people who in that moment cared less about the performance than the person. At last, Elvis stepped closer to the microphone. The dome, moments earlier filled with nervous murmurs, fell into a hush. All eyes were fixed on him, waiting not with impatience but with a quiet kind of hope. He adjusted the mic stand, took a slow breath, and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice wavered, soft but steady enough to reach the far corners of the Astrodome. "I need to tell you something honest." The crowd leaned in. "I've been on stage for a lot of years now. I thought I knew how to do this, but when I walked out here tonight, I got scared, really scared." Those words cut through the cavernous space more powerfully than any opening note could have. The fans didn't hear a superstar posturing, they heard a man admitting his fear. The silence was thick, reverent. For once, Elvis Presley wasn't larger than life. He was human, and that truth drew the audience closer. "But you reminded me of something," he continued, his voice strengthening. "You reminded me that it sips all right to be scared. You reminded me that you sips are not just here for Elvis Presley, the performer. You sips are here for Elvis Presley, the person." The applause that followed wasn't wild or frantic. It was warm, steady, full of compassion. Elvis nodded, the tension easing from his shoulders. "So I want to sing for you," he said. "Not because it's on the set list. Not because I have to. But because I want to. Because tonight you showed me what music really is." He turned from the spotlight at center stage and sat at the piano. The stadium held its breath. His fingers touched the keys, and the first familiar notes of "Are You Lonesome Tonight" drifted out. But this was not the polished version fans had heard before. His voice trembled at first, carrying a fragility that felt less like performance and more like confession. "Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me tonight?" Each lyric carried the weight of his earlier words, as though he were speaking directly to each person in the dome. And when he reached the spoken word section, he didn't recite it as written. Instead, he let the moment guide him. "You know, I was lonesome tonight. I was scared tonight. But you showed me I sit not alone. None of us are alone when we sit together like this." For many in the audience, it was a sacred moment. People wept quietly. Others closed their eyes. As if in prayer, it no longer felt like a concert. It felt like communion. The Astrodome, built for rodeos and baseball, became for a few minutes a sanctuary of shared humanity. When Elvis finished, he looked out at the crowd with wonder. The fear that had threatened to undo him had instead become the bridge that connected him more deeply than ever before. Every song that followed carried that same raw honesty. He laughed between numbers, admitted his nerves, and gave thanks with a sincerity that made the night unforgettable. In that moment, Elvis Presley did more than sing. He revealed his soul, and the world saw that even the king of rock and roll was at heart a man who longed for connection. When the final notes of the concert faded, Elvis walked off the Astrodome stage carrying something new. What could have been remembered as a moment of weakness was instead transformed into a story of grace. The fear he admitted, the pause that unsettled him, had not driven fans away. It had drawn them closer. They could have left, he would later reflect. But they stayed. They reminded me why I love doing this. That realization reshaped his outlook on performing. For years he had carried the weight of expectation, the need to live up to his own legend, to deliver perfection every night. But the Houston shows revealed something profound. Audiences didn't just want flawless music, they wanted connection, they wanted authenticity. They wanted Elvis not only as a performer, but as a person. From that point on, his concerts carried a different spirit. James Burton, his guitarist, later noted how Elvis seemed more relaxed after Houston, more willing to laugh on stage, to speak openly between songs. He no longer felt the need to hide every crack in the armor. Instead, he leaned into those moments, allowing honesty to deepen the experience. He would share stories, admit to being tired or nervous, and even poke fun at himself. Far from weakening his image, this made fans love him even more. Offstage, too, the experience left its mark. Elvis had long battled loneliness in private. Nights spent isolated in hotel rooms, the burden of being surrounded, yet often feeling alone. After Houston, he seemed more open to leaning on others, more willing to acknowledge when he needed support. Those close to him noticed that the weight of being Elvis felt a little lighter, as though the Astrodome had shown him he didn't always have to be larger than life. For fans, the memory of those concerts became legendary. Whether or not every detail unfolded exactly as retold, what mattered was the truth behind the story, that Elvis had shown vulnerability and that his audience had answered with compassion. Bootleg recordings of the shows circulated for years, treasured not only for the songs but for the atmosphere. Fans claimed you could hear the love in the applause, the gentleness in the way the crowd shifted from demand to support. Some described the Astrodome concert as feeling more like a church service than a rock and roll show. It wasn't just entertainment, it was communion, a rare moment of collective humanity. One fan put it simply, "I went to see Elvis Presley perform. Instead, I saw Elvis Presley become human, and that was more powerful than any song he could have sung." What could have been remembered as a stumble instead became a turning point. Elvis himself summed it up best in a remark to his close friend Red West. "People don't sit love you because you sit perfect. They love you because you sit real." The Houston concerts proved that truth. In showing his humanity, Elvis had deepened his bond with his fans forever. And in the decades since, that story has continued to resonate, not as a tale of failure, but as one of the most profound lessons of his career, that sometimes the greatest strength is found in admitting fear. The Houston Astrodome shows of 1970 were supposed to be a spectacle, a triumph of scale and sound, and they were. Elvis Presley performed before record-breaking crowds, reaffirming his place as the world's most electrifying entertainer. But what fans remember most isn't just the size of the crowd or the power of the songs. They remember a moment, whether seconds or minutes, when Elvis seemed vulnerable, when the king looked human. That moment, retold for decades, has become part of his legend, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. Elvis admitted his fear, and instead of turning away, the audience leaned closer. They offered compassion where others might have demanded perfection, and in doing so they revealed the true magic of music, its power to connect us, not as performer and fan but as people. For Elvis, the lesson lasted far beyond Houston. He carried it into his later performances, embracing moments of honesty and weaving them into his shows. He learned that the crown he wore did not have to be a mask, that fans didn't love him because he was untouchable. They loved him because in his songs and in his struggles he reflected something they recognized in themselves. And that truth extends far beyond the stage. Every one of us knows what it is to feel afraid, to question whether we're enough, to stand in front of our own crowds and wonder if we'll falter. Elvis's story reminds us that when we let down the mask, when we dare to be vulnerable, we give others the chance to respond with compassion. So here is the question this story leaves us with. Have you ever had a moment when fear turned into connection? When your own honesty opened the door to someone else's kindness? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story moved you, remember what Elvis discovered in Houston. People don't love us because we're perfect. They love us because we're real.